when a homeless teenager made the ultimate sacrifice and gave his only blanket to a shivering stranger under a bridge. He had no idea that man was a Hell's Angel whose brotherhood lived by an unbreakable code. By morning, something so extraordinary had happened that it would change both their lives forever and restore your faith in humanity when you least expect it. But what did those hardened bikers do when they found their brother sleeping under that teenager's blanket that left witnesses speechless? The sound of 18-wheelers thundering overhead mixed with the distant hum of late-night traffic as October wind whistled through the skeletal framework of the abandoned bridge, carrying the scent of motor oil and damp concrete that had become as familiar as breathing to 17-year-old Marcus Parker. He pulled his grandmother's wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, feeling the frayed edges that told the story of 8 months on the streets, 8 months since the foster system had failed him one last time, and he'd chosen the uncertainty of freedom over another group home that felt more like a prison. The blanket still held traces of her lavender perfume if he buried his nose deep enough in its folds, still carried the memory of Sunday mornings when she'd wrap him in it while teaching him to bake cookies, her weathered hands guiding his small fingers as she whispered stories about their family history, about ancestors who survived hardships and difficult times with nothing but hope and each other. Marcus shifted against the cold concrete pillar, his stomach cramping with a hunger that had become as constant as his heartbeat, and reached into his backpack to retrieve a half-eaten sandwich he'd saved from the shelter's dinner line. As he unwrapped the soggy bread, a shadow moved in the darkness nearby, and he tensed until he recognized the limping form of Scrappy, the three-legged mutt who'd been his only companion these past few weeks. "Hey boy," Marcus whispered, tearing off a piece of turkey and watching the dog's tail wag despite everything they'd both endured. The simple act of sharing felt like the last thread connecting him to his grandmother's lessons about kindness, about how giving what little you had somehow made you richer than those who hoarded everything. The rumble of a motorcycle engine echoed through the underpass, growing louder before sputtering to a stop somewhere in the shadows beyond the bridge's support pillars. Marcus heard cursing, the sound of metal against concrete, and then footsteps approaching through the maze of cardboard shelters and shopping carts that formed the bridge's hidden community. A man emerged into the pale circle of streetlight that filtered down from above, his leather vest adorned with patches that made Marcus's blood run cold even in the darkness. Hell's Angels, Death's Head Skull. The kind of insignia that meant trouble in any neighborhood, but especially here where the police never came and the strong preyed on everyone else. The biker stood about 6 feet tall, with graying temples and arms covered in tattoos that seemed to writhe in the shifting shadows. But as he stepped closer, Marcus noticed something unexpected in his weathered features. Pain. Not the kind that came from a bar fight or a motorcycle accident, but the deeper kind that lived behind someone's eyes when they'd lost what could never be recovered. "Damn bike chose the worst possible night to break down," the man muttered, rubbing his arms as the night air bit through his thin black t-shirt. "Left my jacket at Murphy's after some punk tried to start something. Figured I'd be home by now instead of freezing my ass off under a bridge." Marcus watched as the stranger shivered, recognizing the bone-deep cold that came when you had nowhere warm to go and no one who cared whether you lived or died. For a moment, the Hell's Angel looked less like a threat and more like just another person caught between the world's indifference and the night's unforgiving embrace, and Marcus felt his grandmother's voice echoing in his memory, reminding him that kindness wasn't about what someone deserved, but about what you chose to give when everything inside you said to hold back. Marcus gripped the edges of his grandmother's blanket, feeling the weight of every survival instinct he'd developed, screaming at him to stay invisible, to let this tattooed stranger figure out his own problems, because getting involved with Hell's Angels never ended well for kids like him. The blanket represented everything he had left in the world beyond the clothes on his back, and the faded photograph tucked in his wallet showing him and his grandmother baking cookies for the holidays, her smile brighter than all the kitchen lights combined as flour dusted their matching aprons. This wool cocoon had kept him alive through rainstorms that turned cardboard shelters into soggy nightmares, through nights when the temperature dropped below freezing and other homeless people didn't wake up come morning, through moments when giving up felt easier than taking another breath. But watching the biker's shoulders shake as he tried to warm himself by rubbing his tattooed arms, Marcus heard his grandmother's voice cutting through the wind. like she was sitting right beside him on this cold concrete. "Marcus, baby, kindness ain't about what makes sense or what's safe," she used to say while they sorted through donated clothes at the church where she volunteered every Thursday. Her arthritic hands still gentle as she folded shirts that would warm families she'd never meet. "It's about seeing someone who's hurting and choosing to hurt a little yourself so they don't have to hurt so much." The memory hit him like a physical blow, because those words had been spoken during her final weeks before the cancer took her, before the state decided he was better off in group homes than with the neighbors who'd offered to take him in. Without speaking, Marcus stood up and walked the 15 feet that separated them, his bare feet silent against the cold pavement as he approached the man who could probably snap his neck without breaking a sweat. The Hell's Angel looked up with eyes that held decades of hard living, surprise flickering across his features as Marcus stopped just close enough to share body heat and extended one corner of the blanket like an offering. "You don't want to do that, kid?" the biker said, his voice gravelly from years of hard living but carrying an unexpected gentleness. "Name's Jake, and I've done things that would give you nightmares. You look young enough to still have a future worth protecting." "Marcus," he replied, settling down beside Jake and pulling the blanket around both their shoulders, close enough to smell leather and motor oil mixed with something that reminded him of his grandfather's aftershave. "And I stopped believing in futures about the time they told me my grandmother was dead and I had 24 hours to pack my life into a garbage bag." They sat in silence for several minutes, sharing warmth and the strange comfort that came from two people who understood what it meant to be forgotten by a world that kept spinning whether you were on it or not. Jake's voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke again. "Had a son about your age once, Tommy. Lost him in Afghanistan 3 years ago, and his mother couldn't look at me anymore because I had his eyes." He pulled the blanket tighter around them both. "Haven't been warm since the day we buried him, if I'm being honest. Cold just lives in your bones after losing a child." Marcus nodded, understanding that some kinds of cold had nothing to do with weather, thinking about all the foster homes where he'd slept in warm beds but never felt anything except alone. The two men might have dozed briefly in their shared warmth before the distant rumble of motorcycle engines cut through the night air like thunder rolling across concrete, growing louder with each passing second until the sound seemed to vibrate through the bridge's steel framework and into Marcus's chest. Jake's body tensed beside him, and Marcus felt the older man's hand instinctively move towards something on his belt before he caught himself. "That's my brother's," Jake whispered, his voice mixing relief with concern as headlights began sweeping through the darkness beyond the bridge's entrance. "They've been looking for me since I left Murphy's. Probably figured I was lying dead in a ditch somewhere." The engines grew closer, and Marcus could make out at least 6 distinct motorcycles, their Harley-Davidson growls echoing off the concrete walls like mechanical war cries that made every homeless person within 100 yards scramble deeper into the shadows. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched leather-clad figures dismount from their bikes, their silhouettes appearing menacing and otherworldly as they moved through pools of streetlight with the predatory grace of men who'd learned to survive in a world that respected only strength and feared nothing more than showing weakness. These weren't the Hollywood version of bikers with heart-of-gold cliches. These were hardened men whose faces told stories of bar fights and prison sentences, whose knuckles bore scars from battles that ended only when someone stopped moving. "Jake?" one of them called out, his voice booming through the underpass with authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. "Where the hell are you, brother?" "Stay calm, kid," Jake murmured. But Marcus could feel the tension radiating from his body as 6 Hell's Angels emerged from the darkness like shadow-draped figures, their eyes scanning the bridge's hidden community until they locked onto the unlikely pair, sharing a threadbare blanket. The leader stepped forward first, a mountain of a man whose gray beard couldn't hide the fresh cut on his lip or the bruises around his knuckles that suggested Murphy's bar fight had been more serious than Jake had let on. "Found him," the man growled, and Marcus felt his bladder nearly give way as 5 more bikers formed a semicircle around them, their faces unreadable in the shifting shadows. As Diesel's eyes took in the scene, this kid willingly sharing his only warmth with their brother, his expression slowly transformed. The leader stopped short, his scarred features softening almost imperceptibly as he absorbed what he was seeing. "This kid helped you?" Diesel asked, and when Jake nodded, explaining how Marcus had given his only source of warmth to a complete stranger. An unspoken understanding moved through the Hells Angels that Marcus couldn't quite understand but could feel in the way their aggressive postures shifted toward genuine respect. No one's shown Jake kindness like that since Tommy died. Another biker named Bones whispered loud enough for Marcus to hear. What happened next defied everything Marcus thought he knew about survival on the streets. One by one, these battle-hardened men began removing their leather jackets, each one a badge of honor that had been earned through loyalty and brotherhood, patches sewn on with stories that would make most people cross to the other side of the street. Diesel went first, his jacket heavy with decades of road dust and memories, as he laid it gently across Marcus's shoulders like he was crowning a king. Then Bones, then Razor, then each of the others, until Marcus found himself buried under a mountain of leather that smelled like freedom and danger and an unfamiliar scent, until Jake's voice broke through his shock. "Family," Jake said softly, watching his brothers cover the teenager who'd shown him more kindness in one night than he'd experienced in 3 years. "That's what you're smelling, kid. Family." Dawn crept across the city like a whispered promise, painting the concrete bridge supports in shades of rose and gold as Marcus stirred beneath a fortress of leather jackets that had kept him warmer than any bed in any foster home ever had. The Hells Angels sat in various positions around him like denim and steel guardians, some dozing against their motorcycles, others sharing coffee from thermoses that had materialized sometime during the night, along with sandwiches and blankets for the other homeless people who'd emerged from the shadows once they realized these weren't the kind of bikers who preyed on the vulnerable. Scrappy the three-legged dog had somehow ended up sleeping across Marcus's feet, and Jake sat beside him still, his weathered face peaceful, in a way that suggested he'd finally found some measure of the warmth that had been missing since his son's funeral. "Morning, kid," Jake said softly, as Marcus blinked away the deepest sleep he'd experienced in months, his voice carrying something that hadn't been there the night before. "Hope. You know, we've been talking, me and my brothers, and we've got a proposition for you." Marcus sat up carefully, the leather jacket sliding around him like armor, as he looked into faces that had seemed so threatening in the darkness, but now appeared almost gentle in the morning light. Diesel stepped forward, extending his hand not in threat but in greeting, and Marcus shook it with fingers that trembled slightly from more than just the cold. "We run a garage about 20 miles from here," Diesel explained, his voice rough but kind. "Jake here's our best mechanic when he's not feeling sorry for himself, and we could use someone who understands what it means to take care of people when it costs you something." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 2 different worlds, and Marcus felt his grandmother's presence as surely as if she were standing beside him, her hand warm on his shoulder as she whispered about second chances and chosen families and the way kindness had a habit of circling back when you least expected it. "There's a small apartment above the garage," Jake added, pulling out his wallet to show Marcus a photograph of his son Tommy in military dress uniform, the resemblance between father and son unmistakable in their shared smile. "Been empty since Tommy left for Afghanistan. Could use someone to look after it, someone who knows what it's like to lose everything but still chooses to give what they have to others." As the Hells Angels prepared to leave, returning jackets to their rightful owners with gentle hands that belied their fearsome reputations, Marcus felt something unlock inside his chest, like a door that had been sealed for 8 months. Scrappy seemed to sense the change too, his tail wagging as Jake knelt down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "He comes too," Marcus said, his voice stronger than it had been since his grandmother's death, and Jake's grin reminded him so much of Tommy's photograph that Marcus understood why some angels wore leather instead of wings and rode steel horses instead of clouds. "Wouldn't have it any other way, son." The motorcycle roared to life beneath them as Marcus climbed onto Jake's Harley, his arms wrapped around a man who'd shown him that family wasn't about blood or paperwork, but about who chose to stand by you when the world got cold and dark. Scrappy ran alongside them as they pulled away from the bridge, his 3 legs carrying him with surprising speed as they headed toward sunrise and a future that Marcus had stopped believing in until a shivering stranger had needed his grandmother's blanket. Behind them, the abandoned bridge stood empty except for the memory of kindness shared between broken souls, proving that home isn't a place you find, but a warmth you create when you choose to heal the cold world one act of kindness at a time.